those things affect your body. And we always say our mind affects our body, but our body affects our mind as well. That's why then eventually, this is, in a lot of ways, I really admire the early Chinese systems. People, they'll bring up systems from India, systems from Europe, sometimes systems from Africa. But one thing I liked about how the old Chinese did it back in the days was, especially if somebody was saying they were master, in a lot of ways, martial arts, TMC, Chinese medicine, to some extent, Taoism, were all kind of one. I'm not gonna count Confucianism because that was kind of more based on morals. But when these things were one, that a real spiritual system kind of looks like that. They had the martial arts, so they had the movement. Movement's extremely important. Spirituality, to some extent, practitioners of Hatha yoga kind of deal with that a little bit, but not the same. Obviously, to the same level. Movement's important, but then you had to have understanding of the body. You had to have understanding of alternative medicine, healing. Very important. And then this is why sometimes you have a conflict between the metaphysical community and the holistic community, where the holistic community at times says they just make things about healing totally, right? Healing is, to them, is their god, it's their religion, right? They just focus on diet, that's it, and they'll talk about that for 2 3 hours. And then if they would give a spiritual critique and they would say, well, spiritual teachers will talk all this spiritual stuff, but they're not healthy or they don't know about health. Now I'm not gonna say that's right or wrong, but you can see why that conflict comes in, because if the spiritual teachers were actually practicing an authentic spiritual system, or don't even get into spiritual system, they were practicing an authentic spiritual lifestyle. Chemistry is part of that. Biochemistry is an extended version of chemistry, right? So they would understand healing and alternative medicine and how the body and cells and which amino acids are important. They would understand all that. And when they understand all that, there'll be nothing that the holistic community could do to attack the metaphysical community, because the metaphysical community will be real. But the reason why the holistic community could attack the metaphysical community is because, unfortunately, most people in the metaphysical community are practicing pseudo spirituality. Because chemistry, like I mentioned, and time is not understood. And time doesn't have to be you arguing about if time exists. What we know is that this construct of what we perceive time to be is how we organize events. And it's not as simple as how we organize events. Our psychology changes how we perceive the time lapses between events, which is extremely important when it comes to spirituality. Because spirituality is about being what? In the present. So the way your mind perceives time is actually extremely important for real spirituality, right? And the third layer, or the third reason why you would know when a spiritual system is more of a pseudo system or new age system, is because it doesn't deal with the environment. And the concept of thinking globally, acting locally applies here. When you talk about shamanism, animism, Sangoma, Bonpo, bush medicine, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about understanding that your spiritual lifestyle, right? Forget spiritual system. Your spiritual lifestyle is going to be influenced by your environment. So if you're in Sweden, you're going to be different than if you're in, or certain things you do spiritually might be a little bit different than if you're in India, right? It's so bad even in America it's like that. If you're in the, for a guy who I lived in the East and West Coast, right, things are slightly different, right? So you can see how in the East Coast it might be a little harder to be vegan. It might be a little bit harder to have a vegetarian lifestyle in the cold. You can still do it, but you're going to have to challenge. When the West Coast, it's much easier. Not just because of the weather, but because also the weather influences what? The laid back lifestyle. When it's colder, they want to rush more. When they want to rush more, they move faster. They move faster. Sometimes they're more aggressive. They're more aggressive. That's a different type of food that's going to help prepare you for that lifestyle. So your environment directly affects your spirituality, because we live in in a globalized system now where we take spiritual systems from all over the world, but we don't apply it to our local environment. So we don't know if that spiritual system is relevant for where you're living at. Because remember, the reason why it may seem strange is because we forgot the fact that real spirituality just really dealt with time and chemistry. And time and chemistry, let's be real, we live in different time zones, but everywhere around the world is 23 hours and 56 minutes, which you could say 24 hours. Might be different time zones, but for the most part, the time itself doesn't change. Just one place might be at a certain time before the other place. But we all got to cross that threshold. No matter where you are, the 7 planets or 10 planets are all influencing us. No matter where you are, right? Hydrogen is hydrogen. Nitrogen is nitrogen. Oxygen is oxygen. Molecules might get a little different sometimes, but for the most part, even they're stable. So when you look at it, because we don't understand the fundamentals that time and chemistry specifically are the foundations of any real spiritual system, when we miss the third level, which the third layer is the environment, if we don't get the first two, how we can get the last one? So a lot of spiritual systems are actually going 0 for 3. When they're going 0 for 3, then what happens? Big problems happen, because then you're practicing a pseudo spiritual system. You're practicing something that the fact that you say spiritual system is really supposed to be spiritual lifestyle. That's why in a lot of ways Buddhism, I mean, they haven't got it, every system has, its rights and its wrongs. But one thing I always admired about Buddhism was seen as a lifestyle. That's why you didn't see Buddhists getting into conflicts with other systems as much as other religions do. Because for Buddhism is a lifestyle. If I consider myself a Sufi, right? Let's just say I consider myself a Sufi. And I come in and I'm chopping it up with a Buddhist. There's no conflict. Because a Buddhist just looks at Buddhism as a lifestyle, and Buddha himself didn't get into the rigid dogma. He was coming from the Hindu dogma. So he said, we're not going to even argue about when the world came about. We're not going to get into certain things that doesn't really matter to your spirituality. We're going to keep it simple. And I respect that, to be honest. There's no question about it, because when you look at it, even if you have that mindset, and because no matter what, you don't need me to ask if your spiritual system is a New Age system or pseudo philosophy or pseudo spiritual system or pseudo spirituality. Why? Just look at the list: time, chemistry, your environment. If your system doesn't, and even the environment, I'm gonna be nice and say time and chemistry is the first two. You want to put number 3, you could. I think you have to, right? But because the land that you're living on totally influences your spirituality. But even if you don't want to, I'll be nice and say you don't even have to put number 3. But number 2, the first 2, you can look at the spiritual system and you can tell very quickly if your spiritual system doesn't have one of those 2 things. And all you got to do is just look at your understanding of it. If you never even mentioned chemistry, and when I'm saying chemistry, it doesn't have to be chemistry as you think of as science in school, but it could be the system itself telling you that you have to do a certain behavior to change the prototype or the chemistry or the makeup, the chemical makeup of your body. You don't have to say it's the fall of mankind. You don't got to do, if all that stuff makes you feel uncomfortable, it's cool. But your system has to address that. So if you pick up a magic book and the magic book is giving you spells, how could those spells work if you have the same low vibrations you had before? If you pick up a book and it talks about your race is the greatest race on earth, right? Because of the color you have or the color you don't have. Because you're white or you're black, whatever, right? If you have a book that's telling you that, that's not explaining the chemical makeup of your body and improving it. So I don't gotta tell you that's a pseudo spiritual system. That just based on that, you kind of know the answer to that already. Because at the end of the day, scientifically, their race, as we know it, is a social and political construct. Doesn't mean it's not real. It's very real. Because the average person doesn't think in terms of cells and chemistry. He or she just looks at what a person looks like, how they talk, where you think they're from. But those are social things, to some extent tied into economic things, right? That has nothing to do with science. So if I write a book and I'm talking about race, That doesn't have to be a spiritual book. It doesn't have to be a science book. That's a book that's talking about race, which is a very important topic, right? But that doesn't mean it has to be a spiritual book or science book. Once you make it that, I don't got to say what it is. The answer is for itself. That's the difference. Because chemistry-wise, very little difference in race. The only difference in race would be then tied into the environment. Different races evolve differently based on the locations of the earth, the environment. But for the most part, the chemistry is not at all different. If anything, the microbiome, right, which is a secondary genome, will be different. If you live in Europe, you're gonna have a different. If you live in if you live in North Dakota, right? But for the most part, most human beings are gonna be 65 to 75% water. Most human beings are gonna have 62, probably 62 natural minerals found in their body. Most human beings are gonna have one heart, two lungs, some kidneys. You know, most human beings are going to have the same eukaryotic, which meaning multicellular DNA, for the most part. There are gonna be differences. It's gonna be in the microbiome, and that again is tied into the environment. So again, if I write a book on politics, if I write a book on race, if I write a book on economics, nothing wrong with writing that. Those are very real topics. But once I cross into spirituality and I'm saying, well, you're superior because of this, that is pseudo spirituality. And if pseudo spirituality makes you feel better, that's cool, right? But it is still pseudo spirituality. Now, do I have to say which spiritual systems do that? I don't. Because the purpose of this video was for you to listen to this and you could look at spiritual systems with fresh eyes and you could answer that question. That's the difference. So, it's not about attacking New Ages. It's not even really about attacking the pseudo spiritual systems themselves, because even they have a place. The only difference will be when you're practicing a pseudo spiritual system, if you're sincere on the path of spirituality, the time will come when you're going to have to put that system down and go to something else. It doesn't mean the system is bad. It doesn't mean that you can't use that system for your own growth. But it means, just like kindergarten and first and second grade, you're going to have to move on to something else. That's the difference. And if your system doesn't have these three things, 95% chance it is a pseudo spiritual system. Now you can have a system that has these three things, but it may not be explained right. Like the Tantra has these things, may not have the third, right? The environment part, but it definitely got the first two, right? Obviously the Tantra is definitely into the chemistry, the body, and it's a yoga system. So all yoga systems, no question, is going to care about the mind and psychology. So the Tantra got it. Jnani Yoga got it. Jnani Yoga has it, I should say. Well, not Johnny, Jnani, right? It has it. But a lot of other yoga systems may not. Because the Jnani is really more, yes, it's philosophy, but it's more intellect. And that is usually known as the hardest path of yoga. And because that's the hardest path of yoga, remember, what we're calling Kabbalah or Hermeticism was known to the East as Jnani Yoga. It's the most extreme version of Jnani Yoga. So if Hermeticism is doing the elements of nature, no. Some yoga systems obviously got it right. The problem is going to happen is when the systems evolve and it becomes all mind. So it's going to have one at a time. It's going to have that part, right? Which still puts yoga in a much better position than some systems. Some systems have 0 out of 3. You got 0 out of 3, you got a serious problem. So if I'm talking about Anunnaki, Palladians, Greys, what does that have to do with my environment? Nothing. I'm just being honest. What does that have to do with chemistry? Obviously nothing, right? You can't even verify these things. You don't even know their chemical makeup. You don't know how they affect your chemical makeup, right? Cool. Time definitely has nothing to do with it because we have nothing in recorded history with it. They have to hijack our recorded history. If you believe they exist, which I don't, but let's just say you believe they exist, they would actually have to hijack your recorded history to verify their own existence. So if you're going into the alien stuff, that's 0 out of 3. That's the worst thing of all. And it's not to attack you. It's just to show you, based on the foundations of spirituality, time, and chemistry, where your spiritual system falls. And if it fails, doesn't mean the system is bad. It just means the system, you're eventually going to have to pick something else up, which happens. So, this is Cyrus King. Until next time, peace.